started in hard times to bring us all into the laughter through thick and through thin for public power enthusiasts without.
I'm Paul Dockery, a Senior Manager of Energy Resource Strategy and Planning for Seattle City Light and an energy enthusiast.
I'm Dr. Ahlmahz Negash, a Principal Resource Planning Analyst for Tacoma Power, an Energy Systems Researcher, and an Energy Justice Enthusiast.
I'm Conleigh Byers, an Environmental Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, researching grid decarbonization and electricity market design.
I'm Farhad Billimoria, a Visiting Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies and Director at S&P Global.
Special thanks to our presenting sponsor of today's episode, the Energy Authority, for making this episode possible. On Public Power Underground, we talk about the energy enthusiasm trifecta of electrification, markets, and people. On today's episode, we're discussing entrepreneurship in the electric sector with Apoorv Bhargava, the CEO and co-founder of WeaveGrid. Conleigh and I had a wonderful conversation with Apoorv that explored the nexus of software and hardware. We also talk about transactive energy, the edge of the distribution system, and energy justice. So I thought to start us out, we'd use 30 seconds of theory to do a little bit of the context building, because Apoorv's just throwing concepts out there. He's just throwing them out there. And I thought, oh, we can warm everybody up bright and early at 6 a.m. in Australia. We can warm everybody up with 30 seconds of theory. And I was going to start with you, Farhad, 30 seconds of theory on distribution system operators, DSOs.
Okay, so the way I think about DSOs is essentially trying to transpose what we currently do in the large-scale wholesale markets, where we have an operator telling which power plants to turn on, constraining the system from an engineering perspective so it's safe and secure, and delivering power to consumers. And I think about how we should, as we translate that to the small scale, low voltage and medium voltage grid. Now, there are a range of additional complications that come with that. And as we think about a grid now, that we're going to talk about transactive energy and folks having rooftop solar, maybe batteries in the garage, an EV, there's going to be a need to coordinate that. Currently, a lot of that is done through our distribution network operators. So typically it'll be an integrated utility or a public power agency that does the same function, but it's either it's within a network context. Now what we're saying is we need to enhance that from a system context, and the complications that arise when you're trying to manage that. First of all, you've got to deal with voltage. It's not there's a few assumptions that you can make in a wholesale grid that you necessarily can't make in a retail grid. The integration of voltage and reactive power kind of become really important when you're dealing with smaller grids and managing and balancing those. And the issue of phases. So we obviously have three-phase power. That's the reality. We're not in a single phase. There's a lot of assumptions that you can make, again, at the wholesale level, that there's phase imbalance. Again, at the retail level, you actually, at the distribution level, you've actually got to manage that. And then finally, system security. So we've got all these devices, we've got rooftop solar, we've got different devices and equipment that interface with the grid now in different ways. And they get affected and they affect the grid too, because there's such a scale. Now, Australia routinely in certain regions is moving into negative demand. So there's more demand, there's less demand on the system than there is actually generation, especially in places like South Australia. Queensland is another one which is rapidly shifting it. So to me, that just illustrates the challenges of what an operator in that grid needs to work with, in addition to all the stuff that is going to be talked about with pricing and how retail tariffs and the like.
Okay, you do get a demerit because that was more than 30 seconds, but it was a complicated topic and I appreciate it. So in a lot of ways, the concept is moving that controlled signal that we use on the wholesale level and managing our distribution network with a similar construct of centrally controlled dispatch. Synthesized, does that sound about right, Farhad? And there's complications.
Yeah.
You do a good job with the complications.
So, yeah.
Okay, so one of the elements of that DSO is thinking about the pricing signals on the distribution. When we were talking to Apoorv, he started talking about transactive energy. And Conleigh, and for your 30 seconds of theory, can you give us the transactive theory context, your transactive energy context?
Sure. So Farhad mentioned that in South Australia, there's now so much distributed generation at times that it exceeds the amount demanded locally. And South Australians at one point got notifications to please turn on more devices, use more electricity, because that generation wasn't controllable and it would have caused problems for the power grid. Similarly, but in the reverse, Californians may remember getting text message alerts last summer telling them, please stop using electricity, turn down your usage. So the idea of transactive energy is really trying to harness this amount of flexibility that's in the system from distributed energy resources and from flexibility in demand at the retail scale. So right now, we have at the wholesale level, consumers and producers who receive real-time price signals, but generally consumers at a small scale, at retail scale, generally have a fixed rate or maybe a time of use rate of a few different buckets. So the idea of transactive energy would be using more granular price signals for consumers to allow incorporation of distributed energy and demand participation in the market. Expanding price signals to devices could mean heating and cooling systems or EVs, and it could help manage the grid in times of stress or extreme weather events or better reflect the consumer's actual demand curves. So think in a winter storm, you don't care to heat your pool when there are high prices, but you do care a lot about maintaining a minimum level of heat in a building. However, of course, hedging small-scale consumers to make sure their risk tolerances are properly addressed is a concern. Think how Gridley just passed through wholesale prices to consumers in Texas during Winter Storm Uri. Not a great solution. So certainly you could also imagine transactive energy looking more like a utility or an aggregator offering some kind of contract to take control of some devices for a flat rate to consumers as well. So lots of possibilities as to how transactive energy might actually end up being implemented.
Okay, thank you. So Farhad did a good job of talking about the engineering attempt to move wholesale to distribution, and transactive energy in a lot of ways trying to get incentive alignment, taking a tariff rate, which is fixed long-term monthly type of time scale, and moving it down into more things you can actually respond to based on grid conditions. How's that sound, Conleigh? Did I synthesize it well? Okay. So the third thing we're going to touch on is real quick in the episode. I mentioned the great work of Dr. Destiny Nak and Dr. Su-Chen Kong's an episode Ahlmahz and I recorded together with Professor Destiny Nak about the energy equity gap. Ahlmahz, can you give 30 seconds of theory about what the energy equity gap is?
Sure. It's a measure of inequity in the power system. And so unlike one of the more traditional measures that we tend to talk about, which is energy burden, that is a function of a customer's income. The energy equity gap is a measure of energy limiting behavior. It's the way it's a measure of the difference in temperature between when a low-income person will turn on their heating and cooling, or a non-low-income person will turn on their heating and cooling. And so that delay, that the amount of time that they wait, or the degrees that they wait to turn on their heating or cooling, is that energy equity gap. So it's a measure of energy limiting behavior.
Gold star. I think you even made it in on 30 seconds, Ahlmahz. That was perfect.
I was trying.
Well, with that background and context, we're skipping short to ground this week because we had a very nice and long conversation with Apoorv. So after we get back, we'll come and you'll hear the interview that Conleigh and I had with Apoorv. Public Power Underground is sponsored by the Energy Authority. The energy transition is upon us, and if there's one company who has public power's back, it's the Energy Authority. TEA isn't just any sponsor of the show, they're the backbone of what we stand for, keeping the power in the hands of the people. With offices in Bellevue, Washington, and Jacksonville, Florida, TEA has coast-to-coast expertise in energy trading, RTO management, portfolio management, advanced analytics, renewable energy, and much more. As the energy industry evolves, so does TEA, staying on the cutting edge of technology to help their 75-plus public power clients maximize the value of their assets. When you partner with TEA, you're not just keeping up, you're leading the charge. Learn more at teainc.org. That's teainc.org for more. This week, Conleigh and I interviewed Apoorv Bhargava. Apoorv is the CEO and co-founder of WeaveGrid. WeaveGrid is a Series B software company that drives rapid decarbonization at the intersection of clean energy and transportation by helping some of the largest utilities and automakers transform electric vehicles into grid assets and enabling wide-scale EV adoption. Apoorv has dedicated his career to furthering innovation in the climate and energy sectors. His prior experiences include Opower and NRG, as well as in management consulting and venture capital in the climate space. He was featured on both the Green Biz 30 Under 30 and the Forbes 30 Under 30 in energy for 2019 for his work on WeaveGrid. Apoorv holds an MBA and MS from Stanford University and graduated from Rice University with a BS in chemical and biomechanical engineering and a BA in economics. Hi, Apoorv. Welcome to Public Power Underground.
Hi, it's great to be here, Paul. I'm really excited to be on. I'm stoked, actually.
I am stoked as well. Conleigh is also here joining us.
Hi. Yep, very happy to be here as well. Nice to meet you, Apoorv.
Likewise, Conleigh. Excited to meet you too. I had the opportunity to meet Paul previously. Yeah. Sorry, Paul.
We got to meet at Dervos. And it had a wonderful exchange. I thought really intriguing. So we're using some of that context in this one. But you haven't met Conleigh yet. Conleigh, of course, is one of the brain trusts of Public Power Underground. So I'm excited to get her to pick on you and your views of markets and electric service. Or maybe you all just agree, and we're going to find that out. That's one of the things we're going to do.
We all agree. I'm excited to be on.
Yeah, well, one of the things we do is we like to get wonky, and we also like to understand different perspectives on the electric sector. One of the things in talking with you, you're an entrepreneur in this sector, and I keep pounding the table amongst my peers at electric utilities that we should be enthusiastic about this transition, about what it means for our businesses. Do you think I get that right? Should I be pounding the table at electric utilities that we should be championing this transition?
I recently saw I still exist on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, but I recently saw a tweet along the lines of, this is the most exciting time to be in the electric industry since the days of Insol. And I couldn't agree more. And yes, I purposely used Insol, not Edison, because I think like everything is up for grabs. It's not just the invention of the light bulb. So it's not just technology, but I think it's a rewriting of all the rules, right? And as we are in this moment of unprecedented load growth that the country has not seen since basically the energy crisis in '73, we are now having to re-examine our assumptions around markets. We're having to re-examine our assumptions around what part of the electric grid actually drives the economics of the cost to serve, and then the rate designs that come from there. And then what are the use cases of electricity altogether? It isn't just about lighting. In the words of Insol, it isn't just about lighting. It's now also about motive power. It's also about heating. It's also about industry. So there's so much. And for a person who, has many different passions and excitements and things that I like going deep on, like this is a perfect industry. I mean, how often do you get to re-architect a technical-sociological system like the electric grid? I love it.
Yeah, say that again, because I want to store that word for later.
Yeah, I mean, it's a techno-sociological system, right? It's the greatest techno-sociological system we've ever designed. I won't claim to take credit for that. I think it's inspired by Gretchen Backe, but like I do think that like it is both a sociological system and it's a technical one, right? And it's a political one and it's everything. And I love that about the grid.
No, that's a great one. So one of the things we come back to on Public Power Underground frequently is that the regulatory constructs that we're working under actually got built in like the 70s and 80s after the large build out of infrastructure had already occurred, and it was largely about managing operational costs within the sector. And we have to rebuild those to deploy infrastructure today. Do you agree with that take? And what's your perspective on the challenge of rebuilding it for today?
I think that so much of the regulatory paradigms that I am familiar with from my last 10 plus years in this sector was designed around squeezing out efficiencies in our system because load growth was not a thing that was happening. I think the ability of our sector to provide affordable, reliable, and clean, now that that third layer comes along, right? Affordable, reliable, and clean power, and deliver that clean power to the use cases that matter, requires policymakers that, and this is like one of my many soapboxes. I think I have like a whole floor of soapboxes and I stand on all of them every day as much as I can. But like one of my many soapboxes, right, is like institutions in our country have continued to get eroded, and not eroded because of a lack of trying, but just like we just don't invest in them as much. And so, of course, regulatory staff and regulatory commissioners have a hard time grokking with even more complex problems and even more complex technical issues and even more complex policy designs day in, day in, day in. And somehow they're supposed to do all of that while there is this unbelievable sea change in the very nature of our industry. Oh, and by the way, the policies have to change to support that, to move quickly, to meet the goals of climate change, to meet the goals of affordability. And so I think of it as an unparalleled moment. And I think we have to rewrite rules, and we have to give ourselves the space in the sandboxes to experiment quickly, learn what works, and then move on. Because a lot of things don't work, but we hold on to them. And I know you've got a question about one of those that I'll be happy to touch on later.
So we recently had a discussion on Public Power Underground with a distribution engineer who was making the case that often we do these software solutions when perhaps really what's needed is a hardware investment. Now, of course, this is very much a question of, if you're a distribution engineer, probably, the thing you want to do is more the hardware solution. And similarly, if you're a vehicle to grid, vehicle to home company, probably the thing you want to do often is add more EVs. But can you talk a little bit about this nuance between investing in new technology on the software versus the hardware side, and how that fits into thinking about, from a consumer's perspective, what would be the better choice for the grid?
Yeah, if it's my buddy Bryce, which I believe it is, I am so in line with his views on needing to invest more in distribution hardware. I think let's take a huge step back, right? Like where I sit, we're about to put 2 to 3x the amount of power that we have demanded historically through a delivery system that has no forward planning done for that load growth, and also that doesn't have the flexibility inherently built into it to accommodate all of that new growth. That isn't going to be heterogeneous. It isn't going to be happening at the same times as well. And so we have to both utilize the existing hardware, and we have to invest in better hardware. Today's distribution level comms and metering and so forth, it's just antiquated. It does not support the new use cases of electric mobility. It does not support the new use cases of flexibility on the edge. One of the biggest challenges that the industry deals with is that we believe that DRMSs, demand response is a product, demand response management systems of yesteryear, have the same functionality as what we need as distribution operators on the edge of the network. And that's just not true. Like what I can do when I dispatch 10 megawatts of DR capacity for the wholesale market is completely devoid from what I need, in not an N-1 scenario, because it isn't an N-1 scenario on the distribution edge. And that's the kind of challenge where you need much more hardware. The truth of it is, though, that hardware does not live in a vacuum without software. And increasingly, software is a very helpful enabling tool to make sure that that hardware works, because you also, while of course you need to be, you need to have humans in the loops, literally on switching and so forth, we cannot do everything manually. And the distribution system is becoming an order of magnitude more complex, if not more. And that requires machine intelligence to augment the humans in the loop. So I'm a big believer in software and hardware coexisting and both needing to be invested in.
So I'm going to clarify a little bit. It wasn't Bryce. It was Seattle City Light's own Francis Sammy who makes this point that when you kind of go through the engineering, a lot of times you just need a bigger wire regardless, because you got to plan for the software not to work. Because that's part of what we have to do. Can you talk, and you got your WeaveGrid swag on, can you talk about what WeaveGrid's doing? I want you to give a chance to talk about what you're trying to do in there in this solution space for, I'm going to put up a bigger wire, but also I'm going to make sure my utilization's smarter for that wire.
Yeah, exactly. Look, the way that electrification is going to go is that we've got 280 million cars in the country today. As we want to electrify all of those vehicles, and again, we can talk about whether or not that's the right way to decarbonize the transportation sector, but as a big chunk of those vehicles goes electric, there is a very natural tendency, sorry, not a natural tendency, let me rewind. As those 280 million vehicles go electric, one of the biggest challenges that we're going to face is that the distribution grid was not planned with electrification in mind. An average EV charging at home on level 2 power is consuming anywhere between 7 to 15 kilowatts. That is much more than your home. That is more than 2 homes generally. And that's a lot of power. And often the panels can handle it. It really comes down to something as basic as your transformers. It comes down to your feeders. Now, I'm going to be the last person. I'm a trained engineer too, right? I'm going to be the last person. I'm a trained engineer and an energy economist. So you're going to find both sides of my wonkishness firing up here.
Good, great.
But I'm going to be the last person to argue that any software solution can guarantee to 100% that you're never going to need to build new hardware. Of course not. That's not the point. The point is to deliver flexibility such that the hardware doesn't need to be upgraded and replaced as quickly, and to do so in a reliable way such that it is within the operating conditions of the hardware's stated operating conditions. So if a transformer is rated for 35 kVA and you now add 6 EVs in the neighborhood, because you bought one, your neighbor bought one, and then a couple of other people bought them, well, suddenly you might have a peak condition in the middle of the night where you've actually got 50 kVA on that transformer. And not only can WeaveGrid see that, but we can communicate with the vehicles and the chargers in the homes through enrolling them into a utility program that actually shifts that charging in a way that is, of course, accommodating the bulk system needs. But the bulk system isn't going to be that affected by electrification. It's really the distribution system. And so the way our charging orchestration works is we build charging schedules that meet the needs of the customer, first and foremost. They meet the needs of course, the bulk system. That is generally where rate design is focused. So time of use rates, et cetera. And then most importantly for the utility, we meet the operational boundary conditions and parameters that a distribution engineer expects. And so that's why we call our patented technology DISCO, Distribution Integrated Smart Charging Orchestration. Because for too long, the whole demand side management space has avoided and ignored distribution. It has been a constant conversation about bulk systems. And that's where the cost was. So that's what you had to do. You had to do DR events to respond to peaker power plants that were firing up. And you needed to respond to that. And it was coincident. Well, what if you've got 50 kVA, a 50 kilowatt load showing up in a neighborhood in the middle of the night? You've got to manage that in a very different way. It has to be distribution integrated. To your distribution engineer friends, I would say trust isn't built overnight. This is going to take time, right? I don't claim that my solution is going to ever mean that you're not going to build more hardware. Of course you are. But if I can help you make a better capital decision, do I invest in this neighborhood where there are too many EVs according to the rated power capacity of my transformer? Or do I take that same asset and go upgrade a less a less reliable neighborhood that's having power quality issues? Those are very real trade-off decisions we are making today in the trenches. And I think that's where software can really be valuable.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. To follow up on maybe a tangentially related question. So sometimes when we talk about consumers participating in electricity markets at the distribution level, there's this divide between thinking that that would be more of a price-based system in which you have more granular prices, even going so far as to have distributional, locational, marginal prices in the extreme, versus a thought of consumers maybe don't really want to have to deal with this. Perhaps it can be more aggregators providing a service where they're doing a lot of the control. And where do you see WeaveGrid fitting into that? Is it predominantly going to be something that the utility is sponsoring as the service, or could it be something that the consumers also have more input into?
I think consumers always have input. I think that's like a given that they always have input. The question is, how much do they want to be engaging on this day to day? And I think this goes back to maybe a little bit of what we were chatting about earlier, which is experiments that have to at some point be called enough. For the last decade, we've been playing around with this idea of transactive energy. And for another decade, we'll continue playing with it. And the truth is, consumers don't want it. Consumers barely want time of use rates. You are seeing rollbacks of time of use rates in places where it was poorly communicated to customers. As a customer, I want my power to work. I want my bill to be low. I want it to be something that I know I can pay every month. And I want it to be as clean as possible. That's about it. I don't want to toy around with 10 cents and 15 cents and 33 cents and 88 cents and think about that all day long. I think that kind of dynamicism, I don't know about you, but I get frustrated experiencing that in Uber and Lyft. Clearly services that have been marketized to the point of an extreme. Perhaps some people experience that on public transit. I feel like that kind of dynamic signaling is just not something that the average person wants. Actually, it skews towards the most, basically the richest folks, the folks who can most afford to think about it, who end up having that elasticity to actually be able to take advantage of it. And so I do think you end up creating basically inequity in the system that a regulated service is supposed to provide equity around. And where I think in particular prices to devices in particular breaks is when we get into that concept of distribution price signals. It breaks with electrification. And this is why we built our service as one that works through utilities as the ultimate aggregator, because there are just you just have shallow markets when you get to that local transformer. That's where the majority of pain is going to be felt by electrification. It's going to be at the distribution system. We do not have the technology. We do not have the regulatory mechanism. And frankly, we don't want to create market power challenges where my F-150 can overwhelm the local market. And so now I become the market maker in my local neighborhood, screwing over the people next door who don't have an EV. That's not the kind of world I want to live in. And I don't think that's the kind of world that regulators want to be regulating. Let's just create a simpler approach. And so I do think we're going to see wholesale markets moving to a little bit more of a dynamic world. I think we're going to see time of use rates and so on, just given the variability of renewables and given what we're experiencing. But we can talk more about rate design later, but I do believe that we're moving to more and more of a subscription model of electric service. And I think that subscription model stems from the fact that we're going from a world where the cost to serve was driven by commodity and CapEx, commodity being coal and gas and so forth. And increasingly, it's just CapEx, solar, wind, nuclear, geothermal, hydro, okay, a little bit of gas here and there. And then, of course, the T&D, which is increasingly more than 50% of your bill and will be in the future, that's all CapEx. So I'm not quite sure if the prices to devices and transactive energy approach will work.
I know you want to follow up, Conleigh. You got a follow up there?
No, I think I roughly agree with a lot of the comments you made. I think it is really hard to sell someone on getting very involved in something that has seemingly to them a pretty small marginal return. More generally, I think there's this tension between we want consumers to be adequately hedged and protected from high prices, but at the same time, we would really like to have more demand participation in markets. And as far as how we do that on the small scale consumer side, I think it's very likely that more of a subscription based kind of service model might make more sense. I also think it's interesting to compare this to various proposals that are out there right now are thinking about, okay, maybe capacity markets haven't been working very well for us. Maybe we want to think about some other kind of long run organized market. And one of those models would be to have a forward energy market. So say something like what New Jersey does as its default service for customers, where they're fully hedged ex post. But what that means, though, is that there's not a lot of incentive, at least at the surface, for that pool of consumers to participate in the market. And so it's interesting to think about WeaveGrid or these other kinds of models working with a utility to try to still make sure you're capturing some value from the underlying elasticity those consumers really have in their demand, while still allowing them to be better hedged. So yeah, I'd be happy to hear your thoughts on how WeaveGrid might fit into that kind of model.
First of all, I won't even claim that I'm smart enough to answer all of those things. I love that. I mean, I think it's such an interesting set of experiments we're starting to run to really have more of a conversation about what it means to protect consumers, which I think is often lost in particularly my side of the world, which is more of the like techno utopia, everything can be done through technology and energy, blah, blah, blah. I mean, there's too much. There's too much about that and not about how do we protect consumers in the process of, moving to a decarbonized system. And perhaps at some point I should suggest you invite my co-founder, Dr. John Taggart. He's a real expert on capacity markets and thinking about all these things. But one of the things I'll just say is this, perhaps where my stance comes from is that we have tens of thousands of participating customers around the country already. We run large-scale utility programs, East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, across the whole country. What I continue to push our partners on is how do we unlock the greatest value stack that participating customer and their vehicles can deliver to the power system and to all participants, the customer, the utility, and non-participating customers too. Because coming from an old school DSM framework, one of the most important questions that I think everyone asks themselves is, how do I make sure that this is delivering value to all ratepayers, not just the participating ratepayer, right? How do I make sure that this is driving down costs for the whole system? And I think those cost effectiveness mechanisms that regulators are empowered to use are actually very powerful tools to think at a systems level. Why I don't obsess personally as much about market design is because EVs happen to just have very, very low value for wholesale markets. They just have very low value. That will change one day as we get into more of a bidirectionality world. And yet still, bidirectional vehicles will not be as valuable as full-blown batteries. Because mobility is the number one, number two, and number three value stream from an EV. That's what people buy the vehicle for. And so I constantly ask myself, like, what wholesale value streams can we maximize the value of? So we've got a program in Excel where there's a ton of overgeneration of renewables in the middle of the night. So by co-optimizing the charging with those renewables, we're essentially helping, maximize the amount of renewable generation and at the same time bring down the cost of charging. But in a lot of our partners as service territories, we're actually really managing that charging not just for wholesale signals like PJM's price signal and so on and so forth. We're also in places like Baltimore Gas and Electric and Pepco actually targeting those individual feeders and transformers and substations and avoiding those from needing to be upgraded for the next 5 to 10 years because of this like surge, this exponential growth that's happening because of electrification. And so if I can actually co-optimize for all of these value streams, personally, especially as I think we move to a world where T&D will make up 60-70% of your bill, I think that's going to be the really important question, is like, how do we extract the system's benefits there and do so in a fair and equitable manner, but also a low cost manner, because that's going to be a huge challenge in kind of rewiring our grid for electrification.
Sure. So as far as the cost of decarbonizing is concerned, I find that a lot of the times when we have modelers who try to estimate what future energy needs would be in the future, that in the transportation modeling, it's assumed that in the United States, we would have a one-to-one replacement of internal combustion engines with electric vehicles. But of course, this isn't inevitable. And if we were going to transition to low carbon, zero carbon transportation, having a strong modal shift towards more public transit, more biking, more walking. All of these things, of course, mean changing urban design, but that would come at a much lower cost of decarbonization, as well as many other health benefits and environmental benefits. And I'm curious on two fronts. If you see, as an entrepreneur, any kind of opportunities for entrepreneurs in this space of thinking about engaging more with walkable cities or public transit. A little bit difficult there. That's usually more of a centrally administered setting. And also how you see, EVs fitting into that picture in a way that is still, a boon for society and not just going down the path we've already been going down before.
Yeah. Can I be both optimistic and pessimistic in my answer?
Of course.
The case for optimism, perhaps, is that I actually think energy is also a very centralized, very regulated, very centralized coordination required kind of industry. And so if you can build successful companies in energy, I think you can do it in the urban landscape as well, and in urban mobility, and in walkable cities. My case for pessimism is that I live in San Francisco, and I think we have permitted in January and February, I think we permitted a combined 8 units of housing in our city. 8. And so I'm not very bullish on the state of housing, which actually is a personal passion of mine. I think that's what we need to be fixing radically. We need to be like marshaling, our government to just move at every level, federal, state, local, to really take that very seriously. Because if we can fix housing, we can fix the nature of public transit, which means we can then fix the nature of not needing a car. I don't own a car. I bike and I walk everywhere. I take public transit when it works. And that's the irony of it, right? I run a company that has some of the largest VPPs of EVs in the world, and yet I don't own a car. Do I think there's entrepreneurial opportunity here? I think it just depends on like how much the entrepreneurship you're willing to do is in line with and is capable of pushing policymakers. Because a huge part of my own role at WeaveGrid is in pushing policymakers to think about what the value of consumer devices is, not for old school demand response markets, but also for operational grid flexibility purposes. And I think that has been a hard challenge, not because regulators disagree, but because apathy is easier. And so the same question comes back to housing and walkable cities and public transit. It's like, I'm sure there are going to be great companies that could be built, but like, how much do you want to bang your head against the wall to make that happen? And I don't know. Like, every person is differently gifted at doing some of those things. One of my favorite companies in this space used to be a company called Remix, where they did really help public agencies, and particularly, I think like MTAs and so forth. But I think they got acquired a couple of years ago, and now they're part of one kind of big conglomerate that does a lot of stuff in this space. I don't know. I don't know if there's like a big bull case for entrepreneurship, not the kind of entrepreneurship that I guess I've tied my wagon to, which is technology-enabled entrepreneurship.
So can you speak to like why you got into the EV stuff? You mentioned you don't drive a car. What was it about this specific challenge within the electric sector that drew you?
So I've worked in the electric sector my whole career. I started off as a management consultant, worked with a lot of utilities during the days of ARA, then worked for a company called Opower, delivering energy efficiency and demand response across a lot of utilities around the world. And I think the thing that has always drawn me to the electric industry is that there's an ability to make systematic impact, right? Like you're not talking about, oh, I just did this one thing for this one person. If we can really propagate a solution through an entire utility, through an entire ISO, through an entire whatever, you have an ability to really create impact at scale. And I love that. And climate is my number one thing. If you asked me, what's your take on XYZ kind of healthcare system? I'd be like, I don't know. I have no idea. I don't understand any other problem. Climate's the only one I understand. And so when I was in grad school, I was looking at the problem, and I said, transportation has overtaken electricity as the leading cause of emissions in this country. And we're a country addicted to cars. We are addicted to cars. I mean, again, I'd love to live in a world where we didn't, but we are addicted to cars, and we are. It's so foundational in our culture and our ethos. It's kind of cool, actually. And so I would claim I'm maybe a quasi car guy, actually, but I don't own a car, which is ironic. So as I looked at it, it became so obvious, particularly being in Palo Alto, that as electrification took off, it was going to run into this very hairy bottleneck, which was the power system. We hadn't thought about how the power system would accommodate more than double the number. I mean, there's more than double the number of EV cars as there are households. There's 120 million households in the country, 280 million cars. That's insane. Like, to bring on that amount of power at the edge of the network, that in particular, when you talk about distribution engineers, the edge of the network, which is frankly the least, the part of the system that's been least invested in for the last many decades, it's going to take a lot of work. And so my co-founder and I sort of looked at this problem and said, what can we do to make sure that the transition doesn't hit this really hairy road bump? And in fact, how do we make sure that we can keep moving forward as quickly as possible and make the transition seamless? And the hard part about the business is not just the technology, it's in building all these partnerships, right? We've got partnerships with utilities, but on the back end, we've got partnerships with automakers and charging companies to get the data and the controls that will allow us to meet the specifications that your distribution engineer friend trusts, such that it is a cybersecure, trustworthy, reliable control mechanism that they can trust as reliably, or at least close enough to a recloser on a circuit, right? Like, that's the kind of thing that we need to be able to get to, and that takes a lot of work.
Yeah, you've successfully gotten us at the end of the conversation in some ways back to the beginning. This is a massive opportunity in the electric sector to meet wide demand. And there's a lot of very wonky technical challenges in the way. And luckily we have smart people like you and Francis, Sammy, and you mentioned Bryce, who are at least thinking about and trying to meet the challenges. A lot of these people like to listen to this podcast. We have policymakers and stuff. What advice would you give them? What's the area that you'd want them to think deeper about or research more to meet this challenge?
Yeah, I would say maybe different schools of thought for researchers versus policymakers. We're very privileged to be working with some of the leading researchers in the space. We have some research projects that we're doing, both at Berkeley, at Stanford, at a few other places. And I think one of the things that I really admire about some of our practitioners in the research sector is that as we get reams and reams of data, we can actually start to see behavior change playing out. We can actually start to assess, what does it take to motivate people to shift? And then what value does that create? Because that's the fundamental question that I think all of us are grappling with in this move to more distributed resources, to more mobile resources that happen to have energy value, all of these things. It's like, what is the value that it creates, and what is the cost that we have to spend in order to unlock said value? And does the value, very simply, right? What is the cost? What is the value? And does the value trump the cost? That's it. It's a simple question, and yet it's a very complicated answer. And so what I've really admired about some of our research partners is how much they're willing to dig into that data and ask those questions and say, okay, well, what kind of program design is it going to take? What kind of rate structures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Knowing and accepting also, and this is what I really love about some of our partners, is knowing and accepting what has not worked. Because I think one of the problems is we sometimes come back to things and we say, well, dynamic prices didn't work 5 years ago, so they're gonna work now. Why? Well, they're gonna work, but nothing has changed. Well, the technology has changed. No, but like actually the inherent cost to serve is becoming a lot more concentrated on the part of the grid where you don't want dynamic prices. So there's this like loop that sometimes people get into.
I wanted to get into this earlier, and so I'm going to get back into it. At the risk, right? Okay, so the way I think about the electric markets, and similar how it could work on the distribution side, are really their control signals. They're control signals where you have intuition on the value proposition of responding to that control signals. So the dynamic pricing on the distribution network, it may be just an effective control signal to devices where and I think there is a function where maybe the utility is the one that's paying attention to that control signal, not the consumer. So it's not a transactive energy so much. It's more around, this is how I'm going to understand my rate design in the context of these pricing schemes within a distribution system network. So the dynamic pricing, I want to push back a little bit because I do think there may be value of dynamic pricing in order to reflect how you would want to control the devices to manage around those constraints. But I get your point that like transactive energy probably isn't, the end user is not going to be the one where that transactive energy is going to get taken up. I'm an energy wonk. I don't pay attention to I'm not going to pay attention to when my water heater water heats.
Exactly. And I think, forget all the the intertemporal effects of dynamic pricing and so forth. I am 100% behind control signals. I'm 100% behind us saying there can be dynamic control signals. We all use dynamic control signals in any power plant operations, distribution operations, transmission operations. Of course we do. I think the word that in particular I get hung up in is dynamic prices, because I think prices are reflective of what the consumer sees. And I think, then we say, oh, but it's rate design. Well, is it rate design? Is it prices? Let's be clear about what we're trying to tackle, because I think we can absolutely have dynamic signals. We use dynamic signals. We have a ton of dynamic signals flowing into our system from our utilities. We generate our own dynamic signals that we send back based on our predictions and what did we get.
But prices can be an aggregation of different types of signals into a standardized format that has some intuition. And it's a way to actually put it into a common unit. Does that make sense?
Exactly.
Price is just a common unit for control signals.
It is. I think where I get nervous based on the previous experiments that I have seen is that very quickly unravels towards this concept of completely dynamic, completely transactive, and now everyone has to be watching their water heater and their EV and their thermostat every minute of every day.
Yeah, we got to divorce those.
We got to divorce those, right? And I think one premise that I think we all probably hold to be very true, especially given on a public power podcast, right, is this is a fundamental service. It is something that everyone relies on, and I think something that I take extremely seriously, that I find some of the noise in the industry doesn't, is this notion of equity. I really get very worried. I coined a term it's a hot take, but it's something I call grid lining. I don't like haves and have-nots in our grid. I do want us to actually create an equitable and fair grid where you can have access to it no matter who you are. And I think convoluted pricing schema make it very hard for the least, the least capable to afford it. And I'm not into that, right? I think we need it to be affordable, we need it to be reliable, we need it to be clean, and we need it to be equitable. And so that's partially where I come from, because I don't think that the data has shown, unfortunately, that these experiments have actually led to equitable outcomes. So, But I'm with
And
you.
I want to just call back to an interview we did with Destiny Knock, which makes, you made this point, and to underline it, the people who can actually respond to prices are the people who probably can most afford the energy, right? And that Dr. Destiny Knock, along with Dr. Su-Cheng Kong, did the energy equity gap analysis that really demonstrates this. The people that least can afford it are the ones who are have the least response capability.
That's exactly right.
Anyway,
and
I kept going.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No.
This is
I was
fun.
just gonna. This is fun. So thank you for thank you for entertaining my wonkishness. I mean, the only other point I'll make is, so I was talking about researchers. Maybe I'll add policymakers, because we do engage with PUCs and PSCs around the whole country. We engage with the public, the federal level, and my policy team works very, very closely with a lot of advocacy groups to just make sure that, like, we are informed and educated. Policymakers are informed and educated on what solutions exist. And what I mean by that is this. So back to a little, maybe pulling that thread again, I think there is a very clear and easy way where customers can receive benefits for participating in programs that deliver the maximum grid value. In fact, through the work that we are doing, we're able to drive enough value that it is actually beneficial for all ratepayers, participating or not, right? That's a novel concept. Back in the days of old school DSM, we hit a point where the ratepayer impact score, the RIM score as it was known, ratepayer impact measurement, became something kind of toxic. You didn't talk about it really. It was like, oh, like if I'm giving a light bulb to one household, it actually doesn't create value for the people who don't participate and stuff like that, right? Like, I'm not going to get into the weeds of all of it. But the point is, these questions of cost shift are increasingly coming up. Of course, in California with NEM, and DSM has suffered from it. And I think one of the things I come back to is that policymakers are increasingly grappling with very dynamic waters, right? You've got load growth like you've never seen before. You've got a series of challenges on the horizon between decarbonization, reliability, affordability. And at the same time, you've got to push your utilities to take advantage of every tool in the toolkit. And often I find that the places that policymakers need to invest a lot of time, it eats up so much time that they leave low-hanging fruit on the table. They say, oh, low-hanging fruit, we'll come back to that tomorrow. That's obvious. It's a win-win for everyone. So of course we'll do that. But then 6 months down the road and you're still discussing the hairy topic and the low-hanging fruit has not been deployed. Well, there's a time value of money. There's a time value of carbon. There's a time value of just the whole system working well. And I think that time value adds up over time, right? I mean, it is painful the longer and longer regulators take to make decisions. And so we've got to figure out these hairy questions around interconnection. We've got to figure out these hairy questions around cost shift. But we've also got to take advantage of the solutions that just work. And I think that's what I keep coming back to when I go to the NARUCs of the world, where I'm like, folks, this stuff works. Let's just use it. You don't have to believe that it works for every single thing, but let's use it where it does work at least. So that's maybe a little bit of my perspective and advice for the hair on fire entrepreneur speaking to policymakers.
Yeah, it's okay to do the easy stuff. Actually, let's just do that and the other stuff too.
Exactly.
Yep. Conleigh, any follow up there? Or are we ready?
Yeah, we're ready.
Okay. Well, this season on Public Power Underground, I'm hosting an Energy System Analogies World Cup, which I call the ESA World Cup. I'm going to get you to rank all of the prior analogies that are in our field of World Cup, the analogy field. But you, as a guest on Public Power Underground, get to submit your own analogy for future participants to vote on and possibly compete in our ESA World Cup Championship tournament. We're going to unveil a World Cup trophy later on. So you could have a trophy on your shelf from Public Power Underground. Do you want to submit an analogy?
I absolutely want to submit an analogy.
What do you got?
Yeah.
What is your analogy for this energy system?
Okay, I'm going to give you the easy one, which I actually deeply really like, but the one that I want to submit is going to be slightly different. So I'm going to give you the quick one. The quick one is, I do think the energy system is looking more and more, there's a very serious one, which is like, I think the energy system is looking more and more like cellular networks. We are getting to a world where, just like cellular networks, the sheer cost of CapEx will dwarf the OpEx. And actually, that is one of the reasons where you go back to subscription rates and so forth. Like, we're going to start getting to a world where the value we get from electricity is going to be driven by the T&D that we deploy, right, which will make up 60 to 70% of our bill, and then a lot of CapEx heavy clean energy sources. And so that mimics and looks very similar to, your fiber, your cellular networks, a lot of the telecom we have in our lives, which we become used to paying not per minute or per cent or per megabyte anymore, but now we pay, honestly, I paid $45 a month to AT&T. And I think the EV is going to be the cell phone moment for our industry. I think that's where it happens. I think the EV is the cell phone for data networks. So that's my serious analogy. I have a more fun one.
Can I follow up? Because you mentioned we used to pay per minute, we used to pay per text. Now we just pay our is that like going from our volumetric rate on our energy bill, and we're going to start actually paying more fixed costs for the T&D networks? That's what you're predicting. That's where we're going, and you can see it coming. The train's going to hit us all.
And I just want to be clear. There is constant load balancing happening here. There's constant load optimization happening on both the edge device and on the network side, because when you walk out from a 5G plus network to a 4G LTE, that's load balancing. It's saying I'm going to throttle the amount of megabytes you get in a second, or the gigabytes you get in a second, right, to actually do that. And
this is kind of controversial. Yeah, we don't want to do that with electric service. Are you kidding? Okay, that's what you're proposing.
But what's the demand response program? That's exactly what you're doing.
That's what price responsive demand is. Holy cow. Okay. Yeah, what's your other analogy?
All right.
Well, before we go to that one, so maybe I can just add, I think Tesla's charging infrastructure is the CDMA network. Does it play nicely with others?
A hot take. Oh, that's a hot take. I like that.
You gotta help out somebody who's not as wonky. What's the CDMA? Sorry.
So CDMA is, as opposed to GSM, are two different, I guess, the ways of doing radio communication technology. Mm-hmm. And so, this is one of the reasons why if you historically had a Verizon phone, you could not jailbreak it and use it, abroad, because that was a CDMA, wasn't GSM.
Okay. Good take.
It's such an interesting question, which is does America stay on CDMA forever though, after the NACS conversion happened last year? And so that's for the next podcast with y'all, because I love that company. I think that's such a great take. And where public charging is versus, that's the other really interesting part about charging, right? Which is so many people often lump us with charging companies, and we're not a charging company. We're a software company that works with distribution operations teams and program managers and utilities. 80% of charging happens at home, right? In the long term, that may go down to about 60%, but it is a fundamentally different fueling infrastructure that's required when 60 to 80% of your charging will happen at home and workplace, and not on the fast chargers on the highways. And so
why can't we increase that? Why can't it stay at 80%? This is my dream. Charge at work, at home on 110.
I agree. I love that. I'm a huge proponent of that. Why can we not do it more? I think it'll stay there a lot longer than people think. That's my other hot take. I think we're going to see a lot more public charging infrastructure. Multifamily charging infrastructure, workplace infrastructure. So we'll see a lot more home and workplace programs and so forth. Yeah.
110 outlets everywhere. Give me 110 outlets, all the parking lots. They're beautiful. I love it. Every time I see one, I'm like, I love that. That's great.
You love that.
Anyway, what's your other analogy? I'm running along. I keep hijacking.
It's a well-stocked bar. Hear me out. So the electric grid is a well-stocked bar. You've got different drinks that represent different sources of energy. And when you're mixing a cocktail, you've basically got all these different things being brought together, right? Your different cocktails are different sources. Okay, great. You're trying to bring them together to run a bar. You've got patrons coming in who want different cocktails, but they also want it at different strengths. So now you have to supply and demand accordingly. Now, when you've got a really busy happy hour, a Friday night or a Saturday night, you as a bartender have to do the job of making sure that you can meet their needs. You're not making somebody wait for 10 minutes because there's 5 people ahead of you. You got to make those drinks really quickly. So you're firing up your peaker power plants. You're doing anything you can. You're pulling out a glass out of the dishwasher as quickly as possible. And you've got to do that without spills and delays, right? At the same time, he's going to maintain cleanliness. That's your operations. You've got to make sure that there's safety. You're not dropping glasses everywhere. You've got to make sure that you're looking at your equipment. Have you run out of glasses? Have you run out of any of the mixers? All of that, right? So that's running the bar. But the key thing is, as an operator, you never want your patrons to get blackout. That was it.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Oh, that's good. You never want them to black out at your bar. That's a good one. Love it. I also love that, like, the marginal glass on the shelf is where you make your dollar, right? So you have to keep that glass handy. You may not need it all the time, but you have to have that marginal glass handy for the surge at happy hour. That is a great analogy. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. This was such a pleasure. I had so much fun doing this.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you coming on. I hope you felt the appreciation, and I hope you feel seen and heard. Thank you for coming.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. Thank you both for having me.
Yes, thank you. Now back to Ahlmahz and Farhad for more. Welcome back. We get to debrief from the interview with Apoorv. Any insights or thoughts you wanted to throw in, Ahlmahz, from the conversation?
So, I don't know if this has come across. So this podcast, you introduce it every episode as being that trifecta of energy markets, electrification, and people. And I don't know if it comes across, but I don't share the enthusiasm, the level of enthusiasm for markets that the rest of the people in this room do. And so I actually appreciated this conversation because I felt like he was very practical about markets. Like they're good for what they are, but recognizes that they don't always produce equitable outcomes. And in a world or a future where we want to prioritize energy justice, markets might not be what actually facilitates that. So I just found it refreshing to have a guest that shared my more muted enthusiasm. No pessimism, but just muted enthusiasm for markets. And I thought his concepts for like a subscription way of paying for electricity. I've always been fascinated with that notion as well, like seeing our electricity rates go the same way that our cell phone rates have gone. But who knows? We'll see what the future holds. But I appreciate that there's somebody else out there who has that same view on what the future of electricity pricing might be beyond markets.
Beyond markets. I like that. And it was a very helpful, I think, conversation. He did a good job of like expressing the need for electric service and the nexus with energy justice. Any follow-up on the skepticism of markets to our market design gurus?
No, I think, for me, it's not like I love markets, even just from the academic and the intellectual context of it. And it's really cool to have prices and potentially to devices. But there's also a reality and a realism, and the fact that you're dealing with folks that have very different exposures, very different budgets. So a bit of discretion and a bit of thought needs to be applied. I think, Conleigh, you quoted something, and I'm going to fudge up the quote. But when we did our podcast last year with Paul as guest, you had said that we trust markets to kind of, I don't know if I've used that term right, but that I thought was really cool, important, because even when markets were liberalized and we got this new concept of wholesale electricity markets, we've got to remember that the assets that were built were transferred to private sector individuals, and the market has operated with the transfer of those assets to the private sector from the public sector. So it's not like we've built a system day one from markets. So I think we've got to recognize that when we talk about markets being able to do all these great things and particularly make the right investments, we've got to do that with, there's a bit of a hand on heart. We can't say that we've got the proof for it over the last 20 years. We have some element of confidence that in certain situations they have incentivized the right behavior, but we're also faced with a situation today with decarbonization that we've never have, and I think that it's important to recognize that. And I think this conversation did a really good job of striking that balance, which I really enjoyed this one actually, because it struck the right note of actually understanding what the problems are and the reality of. I mean, one experiment we've got, as you said, Conleigh, is gritty, right? In the retail market, so it's got to be applied with caution and with proper understanding of the equity implications as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so the way that I think about this is that, markets are just a tool, right? Another tool to try to get a good social outcome would be to do some form of central planning. And the bet that we're making when we're choosing markets is that we think that we can get closer to that ideal social outcome with markets than we can with central planning. Now, that often is a pretty reasonable assumption when we're thinking about industries that have monopolies versus a market, because there's a lot of things about a regulated monopoly that doesn't make it an ideal central planner. There can be information asymmetries. There can be a lack of incentive to innovate. There can be a lack of incentive to provide good service if you can just pass your costs on to a regulated rate base. So those are important things to consider. And I think it would be helpful right now to make sure that we distinguish between the wholesale level and the retail level. Because when we're talking about the wholesale level, I think the movement that we're making is generally towards more markets, right? So if we look out west, there's more and more entities that want to come together and join a kind of market, because it's very difficult to have some kind of central planner over a very large jurisdiction. And it would be very difficult, especially if we're trying to have more demand participation in markets, which we think is really crucial to keeping costs low in an energy transition to low carbon fuels. That means that a market is really a great tool to coordinate a lot of different agents with different preferences. And that's the thing that can send that optimal operation signal. So, doing away with that, doesn't, I think, make a lot of sense at a larger scale context, but it is a different question, certainly, when we're talking about the retail level. And I think it's really important that we recognize what kind of externalities there are in markets and to what extent it might be really hard to mitigate them, right? So one of those, which Farhad brings up, is that we're trying to do this energy transition driven by the externality of climate change from fossil fuels. So if we're not going to price that in a market, it becomes really hard to ask a market to give you a solution that works well for that goal. And additionally, and I think we'll talk about this in a future episode, if we think of reliability as being, at least in part, a kind of common pool resource or common good, then we can't just say, here is, a factory where I'm ordering my widgets at this level of reliability, and you, my neighbor, are ordering your widgets at this level of reliability. We can't really say that in a power grid, which means that there are things we have to take into account where just pure market forces may not lead everyone to enter the kind of say hedging arrangements that they would optimally. So we might have to do more to protect consumers by maybe requiring load serving entities to enter into some kind of hedging contract. So these are all kind of discussions going on right now. That was a little bit long and rambly. Hopefully we could come back to the energy question.
But I remember
that's all I got.
I remember the same conversation that Farhad was mentioning, and that was your word that we were making. It was a bet that markets were going to bring us to the more socially optimal solution.
I do want to underscore that you made this really nice distinction between wholesale electric markets and retail. Transactive energy is generally a concept on the retail level. Distributed system operations is a concept on the retail level, where you're transposing these ideas from the wholesale market into a different. I think that does get us back to like the conversation with Apoorv around the constraints on the distribution network that we're seeing, and we do need to manage effectively. But I also, before I get there, I also want to underscore a different distinction as well, which is when we talk about the market, the wholesale market, there are actually two different functions there too, right? Or probably more than two, but I wanted to distinguish these two different things, which is like a restructuring of ownership within a region around generation assets. Farhad, you mentioned how in some restructured markets, you're transferring ownership to private entities away from public entities. And that for me is distinct also from security constrained unit commitment and security constrained economic dispatch, which are the functions we generally use, which in my understanding, the way I like to think about it is the control signal. I mentioned that in the interview with Apoorv, because I think about that as a control signal, unit commitment and economic dispatch that says, for the current grid conditions and expected demand, whether you should start up your unit, whether commit your unit, and whether you should run your unit. And those are, from my perspective, control signals, which is distinct from a restructuring of the market for different ownership of different components of the grid.
I think that point around transition of asset ownership and control of assets versus the operational dispatch and the decisions around which plant should generate at particular points in time is a good distinction. I'll just note that this is essentially a problem that is a really old one. And in fact, if you look at the seminal works that introduced the idea of electricity markets, there's actually a divergence in terms of how retail consumers are treated. So in one of the works, which is often quoted by Fred Schweppe and his team, spot pricing for electricity, that essentially one of the foundational elements of that was that pricing would be essentially pushed all the way to the consumer. And this idea of locational marginal pricing that came about out of this was essentially, the idea was that we want to be able to create hierarchical control to the consumer. When we look at another seminal work, which used a lot of what Schweppe had developed, but also developed its own ideas, is Joskow and Schmalensee, Markets for Power. That piece, actually, if you look through that, is quite silent on whether the price signal goes all the way to the consumer, and only in cases for larger scale so industrial consumers is there some discussion of having both pricing and wholesale volatility that's pushed all the way through. So that's, I think, a really important distinction, even at the start of the ideas of electricity markets, that distinguishing characteristic and that assumption was quite different.
Let's follow that trend just a little bit further in the time we have left to talk about like the new challenge that WeaveGrid is working on. I think we see as electric utilities, which is the increased demand out on the grid edge for vehicle charging or the increased utilization of the distribution grid for power generation back to the network. And I think part of what there is good work to be done to try to understand and coordinate that assets on the distribution network. And these are different frameworks for doing that. One, which I think, Conleigh, correct me if I'm wrong, what I understood of WeaveGrid is they are coordinating with utilities to deploy a technology to then do that pooling of this optimization from a central planned kind of framework. And an alternate technique is around the DSO, which is more of a prices everywhere on your distribution network. Conleigh, did you get the same framing as that, or would you frame it differently?
Well, I guess you could think of it as this sort of subscription model. So say you didn't want consumers to experience prices to devices. You wanted to insulate them from that, and you offer them instead some kind of contract, but you'll manage the devices. So you could imagine a utility offering that contract. You could also imagine an aggregator offering that kind of contract to different small scale consumers. And then they, on behalf of those consumers, participate in the wholesale market and take on, the risk.
Things like demand response and other types of programs. Often it's the low income people that have the least ability to respond to prices, or to, like, if you have time of use prices, or purchase things that could like rooftop solar to help them avoid those peak prices. So I absolutely agree with him when he his thoughts on energy equity in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember when I worked at E3, we used to get in trouble for, the suggesting that there was a big cost shift from net energy metering that was at the retail rate to consumers who could not afford or did not own buildings in order to put solar panels on their roofs. So yeah, that equity question is really big. If it was a utility that's benefiting from, managing these devices, yeah, I think it is important to think about how does that surplus get distributed across their rate base, definitely.
I will say, though, that I'm not sure that I necessarily understand why the utility, like why there would be any difference to the customer base, whether it's a utility that's running that type of a program and delivering those benefits to the customers, or a third party. I think they could both do a great job, and they can both do a poor job. So I'm not sure that I necessarily believe that one is inherently better than the other.
I will dive in here because I think there's a technology issue on the operations of the distribution network, where you do need to engage the utility to understand how and where its devices are stressed for deployment of the software solutions. And I think what WeaveGrid is trying to do is work with the utility on where in your network do you have stress conditions, and how can I integrate the software solution for EVs at that grid network? So for that purpose, the technology, like it is like this within the distribution operations function of a utility, understanding your network limits and then deploying software and with the EVs in that section of your network to then help add value to the network as a whole.
And it's really, to me, it's also the level of granularity that we currently don't monitor, right? A lot of the issue that EVs are going to bring, and together with things like rooftop solar are already bringing, is managing over voltage and under voltage. And that's not something that we really talk about much in the wholesale space, but that's going to be really important. So to me, it's a question of what is the right control signal, to use your analogy, Paul. Do these devices respond well to multiple, prices that reflect the potential for constraints, operational and engineering constraints on that system, and respond well to that? And then the next question is, do we want that to transfer over to the end consumer? But I think the first point is, what's the right way to coordinate? We're talking about maybe in the wholesale market, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of points and pieces of, or different resources. Here we're talking about millions and maybe tens of millions and multiple tens of millions in certain regions. So that's a coordination issue. How do you actually get those types of devices at a very at the street level, at the feeder level, and up to the grid? How do you get those to coordinate so that you actually don't create security issues in the system and don't black out the entire system or parts of the grid? Right.
I mean, this is just going like, you can't control where you don't have visibility, and you can't manage where you can't see. And that's a real problem for distribution networks. we talk about grid edge stuff. It's like we got a meter at this point of the feeder, and we just kind of trust that unless somebody calls, the voltage at the end is within our modeled range.
Paul, I had a question though. So you mentioned in that interview the price just being a signal. Did you mean by that you can have the prices to devices as a signal, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the device is going to necessarily pay that price? It's just a control signal, because
that's the way I think about it.
Interesting.
I think about like you can implement your distributed system operations with a transactive pricing energy if you had visibility across your network, and then you can see it's like a visibility thing. It's like a transparency of action thing, but you don't have to settle your retail rates. It's a policy choice about the retail rate you assign to the person on the grid. You would see the cost of having somebody 10 miles out on the end of a feeder, but it's a policy choice that your community can make of whether that person, what premium that person pays for that. It's the same policy choices we make at electric utilities today on line extension policies, and the policies we've embedded into our status because of all the things we built years and years ago on somebody else's policies. And we as electric utilities, or within the electric sector, there is a pooling of policies that occurs, whether we acknowledge it or not, at the distribution level about how our community wants to be designed to serve loads. And this is a great segue. We have very limited time left, but we did talk about community policy, Conleigh. Any final points you wanted to make on EVs and how to form a community and the type of community choices we make?
Oh boy, I appreciate the setup, Paul. Yes, I would. So no shade to WeaveGrid. I think we're going to need some EVs in the future, and it'd be great if we managed them well in a way that benefited the grid, benefited consumers at large. Absolutely. However, I think it is a huge mistake to assume that we should use and rely on personal vehicles in the future the same way we do today. Both from a cost of the transition perspective, it's going to be a lot cheaper, a lot more economical if we transition what's called a modal shift. So from the mode of personal vehicles to public transit, walkability, bikeability. And I know that this is a little bit hard for people who have only ever lived in car dependent or car dominant places to really think about what that would look like. But to me, I think the argument that, a car is freedom, it's like, well, a car isn't freedom if it's a requirement to participate in society, and that's a problem that we have right now. And I think there's also equity issues, around like, is it really fair to, burden people with this kind of cost as well? And there's also a lot of cost shifts that happen, right? If you have a place that's much more dense, so, same way we have cost shifts when we talked about net metering, you have cost shifts when you think about the transportation system, where people who live in denser areas are paying and subsidizing people who live in less dense areas that have longer roads, more, longer, utility lines and everything. So, that's something definitely to think about in the future. And, as far as, safety, right? I think if there was a city in the US that had 20 times as many deaths from fires as other cities, we would think something was wrong there. We should change something about this. What's going on? But, the United States in our worst performing cities does indeed have about 20 times as many traffic fatalities per capita as our peer wealthy countries. So this isn't some kind of inevitable thing, the amount of traffic fatalities and injuries we have here. And with EVs right now, it is frustrating that it seems like we're in a race to the bottom in terms of we just keep making them bigger and heavier. And, if you think about the simple physics equation of F equals mass times acceleration, well, they keep getting bigger, which means that when they hit pedestrians, they're much more likely to kill them. And the US is also one of the only places in the world where, in the developed world, where pedestrian fatalities are increasing. So I do think EVs are definitely come with an asterisk. they have a big role to play in the future, but I think a modal shift is really important when we're thinking about trying to figure out what's the best solution for society at large.
Oh, sorry.
That's my rant.
Really quick while you're on this rant. How late is too late for that modal shift?
Never too late.
So
right? If we think about the kind of, dramatic societal transformations that have happened in the past, right? It's a willpower thing, certainly. And it would be easy to say, this is too hard, or, we'll never do it. It'd take generations. And I think that's a little overly pessimistic. There are a lot of things we can do that are more low-hanging fruit that can make communities much more livable and less dependent on cars. And I think we ought to keep working at them. I don't think it's ever really too late, right? You definitely, North America has gone down the path of car dependency real hard in a lot of places, but I don't think it's too late. And there's, we can put some links in the show notes, but there's definitely some good resources out there for people who are interested in seeing projects that have been successful, even in the United States.
The ability to locate yourself a little bit closer to where you live is I think quite doable today, and more so in the future. So I think then planning around that, making sure you've got the transport linkages, making sure you've got bike lanes, safe pedestrian walkthroughs, I think that is really important. And I think that's actually a funner way to live too. Like, I think there's actually social benefits in that, of being part of a community. I think that's kind of gone away in the last 40 to 50 years. But I think that's what people actually do want. They want to be part of a smaller community, knowing folks in the area. That has very much disappeared. And I think that there should be a bit of a shift back, because there is probably demand for that.
Yeah, the term in urban planning for that is called third places. So places that aren't your home and aren't your work, that you can just exist without having to pay a lot of money to exist there. So certainly third places really get stripped away when you start having urban sprawl, and especially residential areas completely segregated from commercial areas, schools, etc. So a big push to fixing that problem is having more mixed use development. So allowing residential and commercial to coexist, and importantly, not having such restrictive zoning laws that you can only build single family houses. So that's the huge one that we face in North America, and I think also in parts of Australia as well. Would echo Farhad's statement there that, there's demand to have better community. And I think, there's a lot we can do in terms of changing zoning laws and building, public transit, walkability, so that they're viable alternatives to driving. They're not things that people, they're things that people do because they are pleasant and they're better as an experience than the alternative. And it doesn't mean you can't still have suburbia. It just means that we're not legislating that only suburbias can exist.
Yeah, we're talking about city planning, zoning on an energy podcast. And I call back to, we did an interview with Dr. Emily Grubert at the University of Notre Dame, and social planning is energy planning, city planning is energy planning, the transportation policy is energy planning, and the mid-transition is where all these things crash together if we aren't intentional about how we think about our community policy for these issues. So I think it's really important that we think about it. So thank you for underscoring it for us, Conleigh. I had one takeaway from Apoorv that I wanted to get in here at the end, and that is that we need more people doing easy work. His talk about how there's low-hanging fruit across the energy sector, and this, like, his technology is low-hanging fruit, and it just made me understand, oh yeah, we actually need a lot more people doing the easy work. Just go do the easy stuff. We'll get a long way just doing the easy stuff. That's what I'm doing here. Okay, let's hit the typewriter and check in on our ESA World Cup standings from the qualifying round. Apoorv has not voted yet at the time of this recording, but Catherine Blunt did. So I do have some updates on the rankings. The top four remain unchanged. That's human body, backcountry skiing, water catchment irrigation system, and game of Twister. Moving up to number 5 is the electric sector is evolving like the eras of Taylor Swift. We know it's on its meteoric rise. We now have a tie at number 6 between me and Farhad. So I've got the PID controller. Farhad's got the Dabble Tiffin service. We're tied at 6. And then the rest of them actually are unchanged. So that's where our standings are. Any reflections on Apoorv's analogies? Anybody want to talk about a full service bar and how that is or is not a great analogy for the energy system?
Oh, was that the official submission? Or was
the
that
official submission is the full service
Okay.
bar.
Okay.
Yes. The other one, you could also comment on the other one, which is the
Telephone
telecom
network.
Yep.
Yeah, that was the one that made sense to me because I guess mentioned before, I've always been fascinated with the idea that one day our electricity bill will go the way of our cell phone bills. And so that, yeah,
Can you
I like
expand
that.
on what you mean by that?
So many years ago, you could pay a whole lot of money because you had to pay per minute. You had a certain number of minutes that you could get, and then you had to pay per minute. We don't do that anymore right now, right? Because like the vast majority of the cell phone infrastructure is fixed. So they don't care how many minutes you use. You can pay 40, 50, 60, whatever your monthly bill is, and then you get unlimited usage. And so I've always been hopeful that the day would come that our electricity bills would be the same way, that you would just pay a monthly bill and you can use whatever you need.
Too cheap to meter.
Yeah, so people have been
Yeah,
talking
maybe like if we get really good at fusion someday, but
and so Helion Energy in, I believe it's Everett, signed that power purchase agreement with Microsoft to deliver fusion in 2030. So like, well, let's come back and have this conversation in 6 years. Maybe it'll be here.
I also I don't think you have to get to too cheap to meter for a subscription energy service to work where it's fixed cost per month. What you would need is a more control signal to grid connected devices in the home. So Farhad, you've talked about how there are some different energy services in Australia that are targeting like your pool or these different segments of electric service. I think if you get to that, where you have insight into the devices and then have some control signals around those devices, you probably could manage to a subscription service, flat monthly fee. That's my take. Any takes?
well, provided that those consumers didn't override whatever you wanted to do to their devices, right? If it was truly you can use as much energy as you desire, not just at a flat rate per energy used, but as a flat rate period, then you don't really have an incentive to use less energy. But if it's the case that a lot of your devices are just such that you are indifferent to how they're being used by the utility in a way that it benefits the utility, sure, that could possibly work. But you would create a perverse incentive to do a lot of Bitcoin mining in your residential house under that sort of tariff structure.
I feel like even with, so like my my internet provider, like I can use as much internet as I want, unless I use too much. And there is, even though it's unlimited, there's a point at which you will get, so I still see it going that way, right? So yeah, use as much as you want. And then the most reasonable person, 99.9% of people will be just fine. But yeah, that Bitcoin miner would get hit.
And just a very quick historical nod here. There is academic seminal work that addresses this very point in electricity as old as 1983. But I'll reference Hung Po Chow and Robert Wilson's 1987 work on priority service, and Shmuel Oren and many others that followed on from that. But yeah, there's
you gotta send me a link. I'll put it in the show notes. I love you bringing us the historic context and seminal works. Thank you, Farhad. Everyone else, thank you so much. I hope you feel seen, heard, valued, and appreciated. Farhad, do you feel like you're contributing at 6 a.m. in Australia, 7 a.m. now?
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, you are, and I appreciate it. Conleigh, I hope you feel the appreciation of you bringing your authentic opinions about EVs to this. Do you feel appreciated?
I do. Thank you, Paul.
Good. Ahlmahz, I hope you feel seen, heard, valued, and appreciated. and a sense of belonging.
I do, and I also appreciate Conleigh's rant. Somebody's got to do it, so thank you, Conleigh, for doing it.
Exactly
Great.
right.
And we'll have some resources in the show notes for those who are curious to learn more in this area.
Thank you, Conleigh. Appreciate it.
We started in hard times to bring us all into the laughter through thick and through thin for public power enthusiasts without end.
Public Power Underground is a production of News Data and Seattle City Light. You don't have to be subscribed to News Data's weekly newsletter to get this podcast, but it sure makes the podcast make a lot more sense. The views expressed are your own and not the official views of Seattle City Light, Tacoma Power, Harvard University, S&P Global, News Data, or the organization of the guests also appearing on Public Power Underground. Today's episode was written and produced by Paul Dockery, Ahlmahz Negash, Conleigh Byers, and Farhad Billimoria, and it's edited and published by the stellar team at Pioneer Utility Resources, with sound mixing by Lucas Smith and video editing by Brendan Delzer. Our theme song, Roll On Enthusiast, was rewritten, performed, and recorded by Aaron Guillory and Ian Bledsoe. You can find Public Power Underground on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please share with energy enthusiasts in your life and give us a rating and review on your app of choice if you enjoyed the content. It helps other energy enthusiasts like us find us. Public Power Underground for electric utility enthusiasts. Public Power Underground, it's work to watch.